Listen here, lady. I don't care if you're lost or if some guy sent you here, but you're blocking my lane. Back it up. Now. The words cut through the sweltering morning air like a blade, carried on the thick humidity that hung over Westfield Naval Station. They came from the mouth of Petty Officer First Class Derek Thornton, who stood at the security checkpoint wearing a white short-sleeved uniform that was already soaked through with sweat. His sunglasses reflected the pale blue sedan sitting motionless in front of him, and his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Inside that sedan, behind the steering wheel, sat a woman named Dr. Natalie Ashford. She was perfectly still, her hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2 on the wheel, her posture impeccable even in the suffocating heat. She wore a sleeveless cream-colored linen dress. Elegant, professional, chosen specifically for the intense summer weather and the moving day ahead. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a loose, sophisticated ponytail that fell just past her shoulders, and her expression was calm, almost eerily composed given the aggressive tone of the man outside her window. The air conditioning in her vehicle hummed weakly, fighting a losing battle against the relentless sun that beat down on the asphalt parking lot. The temperature inside was climbing, but Natalie didn't seem bothered. Her eyes, steady and observant, tracked Thornton's movements as he leaned down toward her window, his muscular frame casting a shadow across her dashboard. Behind him, she could see the guard station, a small concrete structure painted a dull gray, and beyond that, the sprawling expanse of Westfield Naval Station. Aircraft hangars stretched across the horizon, and she could see the silhouettes of naval vessels docked in the distance. The sedan was packed. Boxes were stacked in the back seat, sealed with packing tape. More boxes occupied the trunk. A rolled-up area rug was strapped to the roof. Everything about the vehicle screamed relocation, transition, new beginning. And everything about Petty Officer Thornton's demeanor screamed contempt. "I am reporting for duty," Natalie said, her voice steady and calm. It was the kind of voice that had once directed a team of 40 engineers through a catastrophic equipment failure at sea. It was the kind of voice that had maintained composure while coordinating complex naval operations across 3 continents. But to Thornton, it just sounded like someone who was used to getting her way. Someone who thought she could waltz onto his base without following the rules. "I have my credentials," she continued, reaching slowly and deliberately into the center console. She wanted to make sure he didn't misinterpret her movements. The last thing she needed was an incident before she'd even officially arrived. "If you would scan my identification card, you'll find that everything is in order." She produced a laminated card, white with a holographic security feature that caught the sunlight. It was her common access card, the kind that held her entire career encoded in a microchip. She extended it out the window toward him, the gesture measured and professional. Thornton didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, effectively blocking the card reader that was mounted on the side of the guardhouse. He leaned back slightly, his sunglasses still fixed on her face, and a smirk spread across his lips. It was the kind of smirk that suggested he had all the power in this interaction, and she had none. "Look," he said, his voice dripping with false patience. "I see this situation about 5 times a week. You're either someone's spouse, you're a contractor, or maybe you're meeting someone for lunch at the officers' club. But you don't have a base vehicle sticker. Your car is loaded with boxes. You're dressed like you're heading to a country club brunch. So let's not play games. Okay? It's a federal offense to provide false information at a military installation." Natalie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She kept her hand extended, the card still visible, still waiting to be scanned. "I'm not providing false information, Petty Officer," she said. Her tone remained level, but there was an undercurrent now, something sharp, something that hinted at authority. "I am the incoming commander of this station. My name is Dr. Natalie Ashford. My orders were processed 3 weeks ago. They're in the system." For a moment, Thornton just stared at her. Then his face turned red. He let out a short, harsh laugh, The kind of laugh that suggested she just said something absurd, something so ridiculous that it didn't even deserve a serious response. Right? And I'm the Secretary of the Navy, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He stood up straight, adjusting his belt with exaggerated movements. Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're running, but it's not going to work here. Commander Ashford, the real Commander Ashford, is a naval engineer with 25 years of service. She's a combat veteran who's commanded vessels and installations across the Pacific. She's not some woman in a sundress showing up in a packed sedan. Natalie lowered her hand slightly but didn't withdraw the card completely. Behind her, she could hear the sound of horns beginning to honk. The line of vehicles waiting to enter the base was growing. Pickup truck, an SUV with military stickers, a sedan with government plates. All of them waiting, all of them watching. Check your email, Natalie said quietly. There's a station-wide message about the change of command ceremony scheduled for next Monday. My photograph and credentials are attached. Then scan my card, Petty Officer Thornton. Thornton's face darkened further. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked the way she looked. He wasn't used to someone in a cream-colored dress speaking to him with that tone, that unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. Turn the car around, he said coldly. Now, or I'm calling this in as a security breach. Natalie didn't move. She simply sat there, perfectly composed, holding her card out the window, waiting for him to do his job. The heat continued to build. The horns continued to sound. And neither of them was willing to back down. This was the moment everything would change. Natalie's hand remained extended out the window, the common access card catching the sunlight. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply waited, her composure never wavering, while Petty Officer Thornton stood there, his face growing redder by the second. I said turn the car around, Thornton repeated, his voice louder this time. He turned toward the guard shack where another sailor sat, a chief petty officer named Blake Wilson, watching the interaction with obvious amusement. Thornton waved his hand dismissively at Wilson, as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Wilson smirked and shook his head, going back to his clipboard. Behind Natalie, the line of waiting vehicles had now grown to 6 cars deep. Horns honked again, sharper this time, more insistent. A delivery truck, a family vehicle with military family bumper stickers, a government sedan with official plates. All of them waiting, all of them beginning to get irritated. Look, I don't know what kind of prank you think you're pulling, Thornton said, crossing his arms again. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, a deliberate power stance. But I see through these games all the time. You show up, you claim to be somebody important, you think authority and confidence will just get you through. Well, this is my checkpoint. These are my rules. And you don't get past me without proper documentation and respect. I have proper documentation, Natalie said, her voice still calm but with a subtle edge now. My common access card is right here. It has my photograph, my clearance level, my rank, and my assignment all encoded in the chip. All you have to do is scan it. And I told you, I'm not scanning anything until you show me some respect, Thornton shot back. He leaned down again, this time his face closer to her window. You know what I see? I see someone who's used to getting whatever she wants. I see someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them. I see a woman who shows up looking like she's going to a spa day and expects me to just roll over. He paused, looking her up and down with exaggerated scrutiny. That dress is not regulation. Your demeanor is not military. And frankly, lady, you look like you should be at a country club, not at a naval installation. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me who your sponsor is. You're going to tell me who sent you here. And then maybe, just maybe, I'll consider letting you speak to my supervisor. Natalie's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She could feel the heat in her chest rising, that familiar sensation of adrenaline that had always accompanied moments of crisis. It was the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when her vessel had suffered a catastrophic engine failure in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The same feeling she'd felt when coordinating emergency protocols during a pandemic lockdown at sea. But she had learned long ago that showing emotion in these situations only gave people like Thornton more ammunition. "My sponsor is Admiral Kenneth Foster," Natalie said, maintaining her steady tone. "He's the Vice Commander of Naval Operations. I'm sure you have his contact information in the system. However, my orders do not require a sponsor to grant me base access. I have a common access card with appropriate clearance. That is all the documentation I need." Thornton's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Admiral Foster's name. For just a fraction of a second, doubt flickered across his face. But it was quickly replaced by something worse, indignation. The idea that she had dropped a high-ranking admiral's name made him feel like she was trying to manipulate him, like she was trying to use connections to bypass his authority. "So you know Admiral Foster?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "That's convenient. Very convenient. You know what I think? I think you're either lying or you're testing our security. Either way, I'm not impressed." He stepped back and placed his hand on his radio. "Chief Wilson, come here," he called out. Chief Petty Officer Blake Wilson emerged from the guard shack, walking with the lazy confidence of someone who had been standing guard for 10 years and had dealt with 1,000 situations exactly like this. He was older than Thornton, maybe in his late 40s, with a weathered face and the weary expression of someone who counted the days until retirement. He didn't hurry. He didn't seem concerned. He simply ambled over to where Thornton stood, clipboard in hand. "We got ourselves a situation here, Chief," Thornton said, gesturing at Natalie's vehicle. "This lady claims she's the new commander. Says Admiral Foster sent her. Won't get out of the car, won't follow any instructions, and keeps insisting I scan her card like the rules don't apply to her." Wilson looked down at Natalie through the window. He took in the cream-colored dress, the expensive sunglasses, the auburn hair, the composed expression. A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. But there was condescension in it too. "We have security protocols here. We can't just let anyone in because they say so. If you're a dependent or contractor, you need to have your sponsor meet you at the visitor center. That's the facility to your left before the main gate. You'll need to pull out of this line and proceed there." "I am not a dependent or a contractor, Chief," Natalie said, "and I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to do your job. Scan my identification card. It will verify everything I've told you." The horns behind her blared again, 3 sharp blasts in succession. The delivery truck driver was visibly agitated. The military families in the vehicles behind him were starting to get out, looking at the holdup with increasing frustration. Wilson exchanged a look with Thornton. There was something in Natalie's tone, something that suggested she wasn't going to be intimidated or manipulated. It was a tone that hinted at authority, at experience, at someone who had spent decades giving orders and having them followed. But neither man wanted to admit that they might be wrong. "Look," Wilson said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't have time for games. Either you turn this vehicle around right now, or I'm going to have to call security and have you removed from the premises. Those are your 2 options." Natalie looked at the chief. She looked at Thornton. She looked at the growing line of frustrated drivers behind her. And then she made a decision. "Then call security," she said quietly, "and tell them to inform the vice commander that Commander Ashford is being detained at the gate. I'm sure he'll want to know about this." Wilson's jaw tightened. Thornton's face flushed deeper red. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And that's when everything started to spiral. Chief Petty Officer Wilson's hand moved toward his radio with deliberate slowness. He pressed the button, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face, as if he was trying to intimidate her into backing down before he even made the call. "Command post, this is Gate 1, he said into the radio, his voice steady and professional. "We have a situation at the main checkpoint. We have a female civilian in a blue sedan, claiming to be a base commander, refusing to comply with security protocols. She's also claiming knowledge of Admiral Foster and threatening to escalate, advising possible security breach or mental health issue." Static crackled back through the radio, followed by a dispatcher's voice. "Copy that, Gate 1. Stand by." Wilson lowered his radio and looked back at Natalie with a cold expression. "You're going to sit tight right there while we verify your story, ma'am. And if you lied to us, you're going to face some serious federal charges." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Natalie sat in her sedan, the air conditioning struggling against the heat, watching the two men stand outside her window with their arms crossed. Behind her, the line of vehicles had grown even longer. She could see angry faces looking out of windows. She could hear the distant sound of a car door slamming as someone got out to see what the holdup was. Thornton paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at Natalie with a mixture of contempt and doubt. Wilson stood rigid, his clipboard held against his chest like a shield. Neither man spoke. The tension was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional horn and the rumbling of idling engines. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a gray government sedan pulled up to the gate from inside the base. It moved slowly, deliberately, parking perpendicular to the checkpoint. The door opened, and out stepped a man in his late 50s, wearing a navy dress uniform so crisp it looked like it had been pressed moments ago. His chest was covered with ribbons, rows of them, each one representing some achievement, some moment of service. On his shoulders sat the insignia of a captain. But it was his face that commanded attention. It was weathered, stern, deeply lined, with the kind of expression that suggested he had seen things most people couldn't imagine. This was Captain Richard Hargrove, the base commander of Westfield Naval Station. He didn't hurry. He walked with the measured pace of someone accustomed to having people wait for him. His eyes scanned the scene, the backed-up traffic, the angry drivers, Thornton, Wilson, and the blue sedan, and his jaw clenched slightly. "What is the nature of this holdup?" Captain Hargrove asked, his voice low and carrying an edge that made both Thornton and Wilson straighten immediately. "Sir," Wilson said, snapping to attention, "we have a female civilian claiming to be the incoming base commander. She's refusing to follow security protocols and making claims about knowing Admiral Foster. We're in the process of verifying her information." Captain Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He looked at the blue sedan, then at Natalie's face visible through the window. His expression shifted. Something flickered across his face, a flash of recognition or realization, but it was gone so quickly it was almost imperceptible. "What is her name?" Captain Hargrove asked. "She claims to be Commander Ashford," Wilson said, "but we believe she's either lying or experiencing some kind of mental disturbance." Captain Hargrove was silent for a long moment. His eyes were fixed on Natalie now, studying her with the kind of intensity that suggested he was calculating something, weighing variables, running through scenarios in his mind. "Petty Officer Thornton," Captain Hargrove said, his voice cold and measured. "How long have you been stationed at this gate?" "8 months, sir," Thornton replied, suddenly looking much smaller. "And in those 8 months, have you received the all-hands briefing about the incoming change of command?" Thornton's face went pale. "Sir, Yes, sir. We received an email about the ceremony scheduled for Monday, but what, petty officer?" Captain Hargrove's voice was like ice. "Did you read the attachment with the incoming commander's credentials? Did you check your email this morning?" "Sir, The email came in early this morning, and we were busy with traffic flow and Thornton trailed off, his words becoming incoherent. Captain Hargrove turned to Chief Wilson. "Chief, did you also neglect to check your email?" "Sir, we received the notification, but given the appearance of this individual, we felt it was prudent to exercise additional security measures," Wilson said, attempting to justify their actions. "The photograph in the email was in uniform. This person is dressed in civilian attire, and their demeanor seemed inconsistent with..." "With what?" Captain Hargrove interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. "With your assumption of what a commanding officer should look like. With your bias regarding how a woman in civilian clothes should behave." The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. Even the horns behind them seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Captain Hargrove walked directly to the driver's side window of the blue sedan. He didn't lean down aggressively like Thornton had. He simply stood there, waiting. After a moment, Natalie lowered the window. "Commander Ashford," Captain Hargrove said, and his tone had completely changed. It was respectful, almost apologetic. "I am Captain Richard Hargrove, the current base commander. I deeply apologize for this treatment. You should have been waved through immediately. These men made a serious error in judgment." "Captain Hargrove," Natalie said, her voice steady and calm, "I appreciate the apology, but I need to address this situation properly before I take command of this installation. What happened at this gate is a security and personnel management failure that needs to be documented." Captain Hargrove nodded gravely. He turned back to Thornton and Wilson, and the expression on his face was one of profound disappointment. "Both of you are to stand down immediately," he said. "Petty Officer Thornton, you will be relieved of gate duties, effective now. Chief Wilson, I want a written incident report on my desk within the hour. This matter will be escalated to Naval Personnel Command." "Sir," Wilson began, but Captain Hargrove held up a hand. "Not another word, Chief. Commander Ashford will be escorted directly to headquarters. I trust you can manage the gate traffic without any further incidents." Captain Hargrove opened the passenger door of the blue sedan and climbed in. As the car began to move forward, Natalie caught Thornton's eye in the mirror. He was standing motionless, his face the color of ash, staring at the vehicle that was carrying away the woman he had just threatened to arrest. The gates rolled open, and the blue sedan passed through, leaving behind a line of shocked security personnel and angry drivers finally beginning to move. Inside the vehicle, Captain Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. "They didn't scan your identification card, did they?" he asked. "No, sir," Natalie replied. "They refused to perform their basic duties based entirely on appearance and assumption." "That ends now," Captain Hargrove said firmly. "This is exactly the kind of culture problem we've been struggling with. And frankly, you're the right person to fix it." Natalie looked out the window at the sprawling base, at the aircraft hangars and the naval vessels, at the place that was about to become her responsibility. She had known this job would be challenging. She had known there would be obstacles. But she hadn't expected the first obstacle to come from her own people, from the very foundation of the military structure she was about to lead. She had 72 hours before the official change of command ceremony. 72 hours to process this, to plan her response, and to figure out how to address not just Thornton and Wilson, but the entire culture of the base that had allowed this to happen in the first place. The real work was about to begin. The headquarters building at Westfield Naval Station was a sprawling structure of concrete and glass, built in the 1980s with the kind of functional aesthetic that prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. The air conditioning inside was almost aggressive in its coldness, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Captain Hargrove escorted Natalie through the corridors, nodding at personnel who saluted as they passed. His presence commanded respect, but Natalie noticed something else: concern. Worry lines deepened around his eyes, and his jaw remained clenched as they walked. They arrived at his office on the 3rd floor. It was a large space with panoramic windows overlooking the runways and docking facilities. The desk was organized but not sterile, with photographs of ships he had commanded, a few personal mementos, and a stack of administrative folders. Hargrove gestured for Natalie to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Coffee?" he asked, moving to a small refreshment station in the corner. "Black, thank you," Natalie replied. Hargrove poured 2 cups and handed one to her. He settled into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. For a moment, he simply sat there, looking at her with an expression that mixed regret with something else, perhaps resignation. "I need to be honest with you, Commander," he said finally. "That incident at the gate wasn't an anomaly. It's symptomatic of a deeper problem we've been wrestling with for months." Natalie sipped her coffee, waiting for him to continue. "This base has experienced significant cultural degradation," Hargrove continued. "We've had 3 sexual harassment complaints in the past 6 months, 2 discrimination incidents involving minorities, and a general atmosphere of Let's call it old guard mentality. The security forces squadron in particular has been problematic. Thornton and Wilson are just the most obvious manifestations of it. Why haven't these issues been addressed? Natalie asked, her tone direct but not accusatory. Hargrove sighed heavily. Because addressing them requires breaking a certain institutional inertia. People protect their own. Officers protect their enlisted. Senior personnel protect junior personnel. It's an old problem in the military, and one that perpetuates through silence and acceptance. He leaned back in his chair. I've been trying to implement reforms during my tenure, but I'm scheduled to retire in 4 weeks. The institutional momentum is working against me. Leadership sees these issues but doesn't want to rock the boat before a transition. And frankly, without firm, consistent enforcement from the top, people like Thornton think they can operate with impunity. Natalie set down her coffee cup. What you're describing is a command climate that enables misconduct. That's a failure of leadership at every level. Yes, Hargrove acknowledged, and it's exactly why you're coming in. Your background, your record, it's why Admiral Foster specifically requested you for this assignment. He wants someone who will clean this up, who won't be intimidated by institutional resistance. Over the next several hours, Captain Hargrove briefed Natalie on the scope of the problem. He provided her with personnel files, incident reports, emails that documented complaints that had been filed but never properly investigated. He showed her the organizational structure, introducing her, via documentation, to the key players she would be working with. There was Commander James Whitmore, the executive officer, who had been attempting to implement some reforms but was constrained by politics and budget limitations. There was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin, the deputy base commander, who had filed her own harassment complaint 2 years ago and had been working quietly behind the scenes to document cultural issues. There was Master Chief Petty Officer David Foster, no relation to the Admiral, the senior enlisted advisor, who had been pushing for changes but faced resistance from senior enlisted personnel who benefited from the status quo. And then there were the problems, the structural resistance, the personnel who had created fiefdoms within their departments and viewed any attempt at reform as a personal attack. By late afternoon, Natalie had absorbed a staggering amount of information. She had a legal pad filled with notes, a mental map of the organizational dynamics, and a clear understanding of what needed to happen. I want to be direct about something, Natalie said to Captain Hargrove. The incident at the gate this morning, that wasn't just about Thornton and Wilson's prejudice. That was a manifestation of a system that rewards that behavior, that protects people who behave that way. If I'm going to take command of this base, I need your assurance that you'll support aggressive intervention on cultural issues, even if it makes people uncomfortable. You have it, Hargrove said without hesitation. But I need to warn you, you're going to face resistance. Not just from the personnel you'll need to address, but from people you wouldn't expect. Officers who think you're overreacting. Senior enlisted who see it as an attack on tradition. You'll have people questioning your decisions, challenging your authority, testing your resolve. That's expected, Natalie said. The question is whether the command climate will support accountability or continue to enable misconduct. It will support accountability, Hargrove said, as long as I'm here, and hopefully beyond that if you establish the right precedent. Natalie stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the base, at the aircraft on the tarmac, at the personnel moving through the facilities, at the ships in the harbor. Somewhere out there, Petty Officer Thornton was processing the reality of what had happened. Chief Wilson was probably starting to draft his incident report, and neither of them had any idea what was coming next. I want to see all personnel files for the Security Forces Squadron, Natalie said. I want copies of every complaint, every incident report, every piece of documentation related to misconduct. And I want to meet with Commander Whitmore and Lieutenant Commander Chin before the end of the day. I'll arrange it, Hargrove said, already moving toward his phone. There's one more thing, Natalie added, turning back from the window. I want the incident at the gate this morning documented officially. Not buried, not minimized. Full incident report with both my account and the observations of the security personnel involved. This establishes the baseline for my command. This is what accountability looks like from day one. Hargrove nodded gravely. You're going to shake this place up. Yes, Natalie said. I am. Because this base is broken, Captain. And broken things need to be fixed, not ignored. The reality of what lay ahead settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had 72 hours before the official change of command. 72 hours to prepare, to strategize, to understand the full scope of the cultural problems that had festered here. And then, when she took command, she would have to make the hardest decision of all: how to balance accountability with redemption, how to enforce standards while still offering people the chance to change. Petty Officer Thornton had no idea that his refusal to scan her identification card, his mockery, his aggressive behavior, all of it had been documented. All of it would be part of the official record of her arrival. And that record would define the culture of her command going forward. There would be no ambiguity, no soft approach, no tolerance for the kind of behavior that had been normalized at this base for far too long. The point of no return had been reached. Now came the reckoning. The news traveled through Westfield Naval Station like wildfire through dry brush. By early evening, nearly every personnel member who had access to base email had received the official change of command announcement. The attachment contained a high-resolution photograph of Commander Natalie Ashford in her dress blues, her uniform immaculate, her expression stern but professional. Next to the photograph was a detailed biography. Dr. Natalie Ashford, 22 years of naval engineering service, command of 3 separate installations, a track record of operational excellence, advanced degrees in engineering and management, decorations for valor and leadership. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for Monday at 1,400 hours in the main auditorium. All hands were expected to attend. The email had gone out to the entire base at 1,630 hours, right as personnel were finishing their workday. In the Security Forces Squadron offices, the mood was somewhere between panic and denial. Petty Officer First Class Derek Thornton sat at his workstation in the break room, staring at the photograph on his computer screen. His hands were shaking slightly. Around him, other security personnel were reading the same email, making the same connections, arriving at the same horrifying realization. Chief Petty Officer Blake Wilson had locked himself in the office, furiously typing away at his incident report. His fingers pounded the keyboard with aggressive precision, each keystroke a small explosion of barely contained anxiety. The report was growing longer, more detailed, more honest with each passing moment. Because now he couldn't deny what he had seen. Now he couldn't pretend he had made a reasonable judgment call. The woman in the photograph was unmistakably the same woman who had sat in the blue sedan that morning, calm and composed while he had treated her like a criminal. But outside the Security Forces Squadron, the impact was different. In the operations center, personnel were reading the biography with genuine respect. Here was someone with real credentials, real accomplishments, real authority. In the maintenance hangars, senior technicians were discussing the fact that she had a background in engineering, that she would understand the technical challenges they faced. In the administrative offices, there was a mixture of hope and trepidation. Hope that new leadership might bring positive change. Trepidation about what that change might look like. At 1900 hours, approximately 3 hours after the email had been sent, something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rodriguez, the officer in charge of the Training and Readiness Department, was reviewing personnel files when he noticed something that caught his attention. He was a meticulous man, detail-oriented, the kind of officer who actually read the communications that came across his desk rather than simply filing them away. He had been with the base for 6 years and had watched the cultural problems grow incrementally, semester by semester, year by year. Rodriguez pulled up the email about Commander Ashford again. He looked at her service record, naval engineering background, 3 command assignments, and then he scrolled down to the specific notation at the bottom of the biography. Commander Ashford has a documented track record of implementing cultural reform initiatives at every installation she has commanded. That was it. That single line changed everything for Rodriguez. He wasn't the highest-ranking officer on the base, and he certainly didn't have the political capital of Captain Hargrove or the connections of the senior leadership. But he did have something else. He had recognized a pattern. He had understood what was coming. He immediately opened a message to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, the deputy base commander. The subject line read, "Urgent. You need to be aware of what happened at the main gate this morning." Rodriguez typed out the message carefully. He had heard rumors about an incident at the checkpoint, something about a woman claiming to be the new commander, some kind of security confrontation. He had initially dismissed it as another baseless rumor, the kind of thing that circulated constantly on military bases. But now, with the change of command email in front of him, the pieces were coming together. He wrote, "I've heard unconfirmed reports that there was an incident at the main gate involving the incoming commander this morning. If true, this could be significant given her background in cultural reform. I wanted to flag this for you before she officially takes command. We may need to prepare for aggressive action on systemic issues." He hit send. Within 5 minutes, Chun responded, "Thank you for the heads up. I'll follow up with Captain Hargrove. This is exactly the kind of thing she needs to know about immediately." Chun was a sharp officer, sharp in a way that had sometimes made her unpopular with the old guard. She had been one of the victims of the systemic culture problems on the base. She had filed a sexual harassment complaint years ago and had watched as it was quietly buried through a combination of institutional apathy and political maneuvering. She had stayed on the base because she was committed to her job and because leaving would have felt like admitting defeat. But she had also documented everything. She kept meticulous records of every incident, every offensive comment, every policy violation she witnessed. She was waiting for leadership who would actually take action. At 1930 hours, Chun was in Captain Hargrove's office. "Sir, I've received information that there may have been an incident at the gate involving Commander Ashford this morning," Chun said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wanted to verify before the story becomes distorted by the rumor mill." Hargrove looked up from his desk, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "There was an incident," he confirmed. "A significant one. The security forces didn't recognize her, made assumptions based on her appearance, and escalated the situation to the point of threatening to forcibly remove her from the vehicle." Chen's eyes widened. That's a serious lapse in judgment." "It's more than that," Hargrove said. "It's symptomatic of exactly the kind of cultural problem that Commander Ashford is coming here to address. And it's documented." She requested that the incident be officially recorded, not minimized. Chun felt something shift in her chest, something between relief and apprehension. Relief that finally, someone in leadership was taking these issues seriously. Apprehension about what was going to happen when a commander with a reputation for cultural reform took control of an institution that had been enabling misconduct for years. "This will spread," Chun said. "People will talk. The story will get distorted. By Monday, people will have heard 10 different versions of what happened. Then we need to control the narrative," Hargrove said. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the base. "I'm going to send out a brief command-wide message. Not accusatory, not inflammatory, just factual. An incident occurred at the main gate. It is under investigation. Personnel involved will be held accountable in accordance with military regulations. That's it. Simple, clear, direct." "That will send a message," Chun said. "It will," Hargrove agreed. "It will tell everyone on this base that the old way of doing business is over. It will tell them that there's a new standard coming. And it will tell people like Thornton and Wilson that their actions have consequences." He turned back to Chun. "I'm also recommending that you be assigned as the primary liaison between Commander Ashford and the departments being affected by the investigation. You have credibility with people who have experienced this culture problem firsthand. You can help her understand the institutional resistance she's going to face." Chun nodded slowly. "When do you want me to start?" "Tomorrow morning," Hargrove said. "I want you to contact everyone who has filed a complaint in the past 2 years. I want their cooperation in documenting the systemic issues. I want them to understand that change is coming, and they can be part of shaping what that looks like." By 2100 hours that evening, 4 different messages had been sent across the base. The official change of command announcement. Hargrove's brief statement about the gate incident and investigation. Rodriguez's message to Chun flagging the significance. And now, beginning to circulate through the grapevine, the truth. Not the distorted version. Not the rumor. The actual truth. Petty Officer Thornton heard about it from another officer at the Security Forces Squadron. The woman he had tried to intimidate, the woman he had called delusional, the woman whose CAC card he had refused to scan. She was the incoming commander. And the incident was under official investigation. And there would be consequences. In his small apartment off base, Thornton sat on his couch and stared at his phone. He scrolled through the change of command email again and again, as if repeated viewing might change what he was reading. As if somehow, magically, the photograph would transform into someone else's face. Didn't. The woman in the dress blues was absolutely, unmistakably the woman from the blue sedan. The woman he had treated with contempt. The woman he had been wrong about. And in 48 hours, she would officially be his commanding officer. Saturday morning arrived humid and oppressive. The temperature was already climbing toward the mid-90s, and it was only 9 o'clock. Westfield Naval Station hummed with an unusual intensity. Personnel moving with greater purpose, conversations taking on a different tone, the undercurrent of change palpable in every corridor and office. Chief Petty Officer Blake Wilson had been awake since 0430 hours. He hadn't slept much. His incident report sat on his kitchen table, printed out, reviewed, revised, and reprinted at least 5 times. Each version was more honest than the last, but more damning as well. By the final version, he had documented not just the events of Friday morning, but the pattern of behavior that had led to those events. The assumption-based decision-making. The dismissal of a civilian presenting proper credentials. The refusal to perform basic security protocols because they didn't match his preconceived notions of what a base commander should look like. Reading it now, in the cold light of Saturday morning, Wilson felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Shame. Not fear about the consequences, though he certainly felt that too, but genuine shame, because he knew, deep down, that what he had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something darker, something that had been normalized in his environment for so long that he had stopped seeing it as wrong. At 0800 hours, Wilson arrived at the Security Forces Squadron office. He walked past the checkpoint where Thornton was beginning his shift. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They were both in trouble. They both knew it, and they both knew why. The squadron commander, Major Marcus Sterling, was already in his office. Sterling was a career officer in his mid-40s, lean and intense, with a reputation for being fair but uncompromising when it came to standards. He looked up as Wilson entered, and his expression was grave. "Chief Wilson," Sterling said, "I read your incident report. Sit down." Wilson sat. "Walk me through your thinking on Friday," Sterling continued, leaning back in his chair. "Walk me through the decision process that led you to refuse to scan a common access card and escalate the situation to the point of threatening arrest." "Sir," Wilson began, then stopped. How could he explain it? How could he articulate the bias that had motivated his actions when he was only now beginning to fully understand it himself? "I made a judgment call based on the physical appearance of the individual," Wilson said finally. "I believed she did not match the profile of a base commander based on her civilian attire and demeanor. I attempted to follow security protocols, but I allowed my personal assumptions to override proper procedure." "You allowed your biases to override procedure," Sterling corrected him sharply. "Let's be clear about what we're discussing here. This wasn't a security decision. This was discrimination based on appearance and gender. If an individual has a valid CAC card and proper clearance, that supersedes any judgment you might make about how they're dressed or how they present themselves." "Yes, sir," Wilson said quietly. "What concerns me even more," Sterling continued, "is that you involved Petty Officer Thornton in this. You set the tone for his behavior. You modeled disrespect. And when a superior officer attempted to redirect the situation, you didn't defer. You doubled down." Wilson's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to explain the circumstances, to point out that Thornton had been equally responsible. But he knew that argument wouldn't hold. As the chief petty officer, he had been in a position of authority. The responsibility was his. "I take full responsibility, sir," Wilson said. "Good," Sterling said, "because here's what's going to happen. You're being reassigned, effective immediately. You'll be transferred to the logistics squadron where you'll work under direct supervision for a probationary period of 90 days. During that time, you'll complete mandatory training on unconscious bias, professional standards, and command climate. Your future at this base, and possibly in the Navy, depends on your ability to demonstrate genuine reform." Wilson nodded. It was harsh, but it was fair. Additionally, Sterling continued, "Commander Ashford has requested that you attend a meeting with her on Monday morning at 0700 hours before the change of command ceremony. She wants to address the situation directly with personnel involved. You should prepare yourself for that conversation." Wilson stood to leave. "Chief," Sterling said as Wilson reached the door, "what happened on Friday morning, that reflects on all of us. That represents a failure of command climate that goes deeper than just you and Thornton. I hope that whatever conversation you have with Commander Ashford, it serves as a wake-up call. Not just for you, but for everyone on this base." Across the base, in the security forces break room, Petty Officer Thornton was experiencing his own reckoning. He had requested a meeting with Major Sterling, wanting to get ahead of the situation, wanting to explain himself before formal action was taken against him. It had not gone well. Sterling had been even more direct with Thornton than he had been with Wilson. He had questioned Thornton's judgment, his professionalism, and his fitness for duty. He had reviewed Thornton's personnel file and noted 3 other incidents where his conduct had been questionable, incidents that had been overlooked or minimized by previous supervisors. But Sterling was not interested in the tradition of overlooking such incidents. "Petty Officer Thornton," Sterling had said, "you are being removed from gate duty, effective immediately. You will be reassigned to the training squadron where you will participate in intensive remedial training on military standards, professional conduct, and respectful engagement. You will also be undergoing the same unconscious bias training as Chief Wilson. Your career trajectory depends on demonstrating significant behavioral change." Thornton had tried to argue. He had tried to explain that he had been doing his job, that he had been protecting the base, that his suspicions had been reasonable given the circumstances. But Sterling had shut him down. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your job," Sterling had said coldly, "is to verify identification and grant or deny base access based on that verification, not based on your personal opinions about how people should look or dress. You failed at your basic responsibility. And worse, you allowed your ego to prevent you from correcting course when questioned. That's not security consciousness. That's insubordination masked as authority." By Saturday afternoon, the news had spread through the entire security forces squadron. 2 senior personnel reassigned. 2 personnel facing mandatory retraining. Both facing a direct confrontation with the incoming commander. The message was unmistakable. The old way was over. But not everyone was accepting that message gracefully. In a corner office in the operations building, Master Sergeant Thomas Garrett, a 28-year veteran of the Navy, sat with several other senior enlisted personnel. Garrett had spent the last 2.5 decades building a particular kind of authority at Westfield, the kind based not on official rank but on cultural dominance. He was the type of leader who believed that military standards meant something very specific, and deviation from those standards, no matter how arbitrary, represented a failure of discipline. He had been watching the developments with increasing anger. "This is exactly the kind of political correctness that's destroying the military," Garrett said to his small group of confidants. "We're going to have a female commander rolling in here, making decisions based on feelings instead of standards. Mark my words, things are going to get softer, more lenient, and less disciplined." "Sir," said Petty Officer 3rd Class Kevin Matthews, one of the younger personnel in the group, "Commander Ashford's record is actually pretty impressive. She has strong evaluations from—" "I don't care about evaluations," Garrett interrupted sharply. "I care about what her presence signals. And what it signals is that the Navy is more concerned with being inclusive than being effective. The conversation continued, but it was a dangerous one. It was the kind of resistance that often went unspoken in official channels but festered beneath the surface. It was the institutional resistance that Captain Hargrove had warned Natalie about. The old guard, closing ranks, preparing to resist change not through official channels but through subtle, persistent obstruction. By Saturday evening, Westfield Naval Station was a base in transition. Official action was being taken against Thornton and Wilson. Personnel were being reassigned. Mandatory training was being implemented. The machinery of institutional change was grinding forward. But beneath the surface, resistance was building. Not organized, not official, but present, waiting, watching to see if this new commander would actually follow through on reform or if she would prove to be just another commander who talked about change but ultimately allowed the institutional culture to remain fundamentally unchanged. The real test, everyone understood, would come at the change of command ceremony on Monday. That's when the new commander would officially take control. That's when her authority would become absolute. And that's when everyone would see what kind of leader she actually was. Monday was coming. And with it, the moment of truth. Monday arrived with crystal clarity. The humidity had broken overnight, leaving behind a perfect late summer morning. Blue skies, light breeze, and a temperature that was almost manageable. It felt like the kind of day where significant things happened, where the universe itself was conspiring to make transitions feel momentous. The main auditorium at Westfield Naval Station had been transformed into a formal ceremony space. The stage was draped with Navy colors. 2 podiums stood at attention, symbolic of the transfer of command. Rows of chairs had been set up, and by 13:30 hours, personnel were filing in, finding seats, preparing for the official handoff of authority. Captain Richard Hargrove sat in the front row, his uniform immaculate, his bearing perfect. Next to him sat Admiral Kenneth Foster, the Vice Commander of Naval Operations who had flown in specifically for the ceremony. Foster was a commanding presence, a man whose career spanned 4 decades, whose face was weathered by the responsibilities of leadership, whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. On the other side of Hargrove sat Rear Admiral Patricia Moorhead, the senior officer for the region, who had come to witness and officially sanction the transfer of command. In the third row sat Master Sergeant Thomas Garrett and his contingent of senior enlisted personnel. Garrett's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that suggested he was not entirely happy about what was about to occur. Near the middle of the auditorium, Petty Officer Thornton sat with his squadron mates. He had changed into his dress uniform for the ceremony, the formal blue jacket with its ribbons and insignia. But no uniform could hide the anxiety radiating off him. He kept shifting in his seat, his hands alternating between resting on his lap and gripping the sides of his chair. Next to him, Chief Wilson sat in similar distress. Both men knew what was coming. Both had been instructed to remain in the auditorium after the official ceremony concluded because Commander Ashford had requested a private meeting with them. At 1,400 hours exactly, the ceremony began. Captain Hargrove took the podium and began the formal proceedings. He spoke about Natalie's accomplishments, her service record, her reputation for excellence. He spoke about her background in engineering, her command experience, her dedication to the Navy and to the personnel under her care. The words were formal, measured, official. They painted a picture of a leader of significant capability and authority. Then Admiral Foster was called to the podium. Foster had flown in specifically for this ceremony, which itself was notable. Flag officers didn't typically make personal appearances at routine change of command ceremonies unless there was something significant about the incoming commander or the situation at the base. Commander Ashford's record speaks for itself, Foster said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. She has consistently demonstrated an ability to identify and address systemic problems within her commands. She understands that military effectiveness depends on a culture of respect, accountability, and integrity. Westfield Naval Station is receiving an exceptional officer and leader. There was something in Foster's words, a subtle emphasis on systemic problems and culture, that made everyone in the auditorium understand that this was not a routine change of command. The senior leadership was explicitly signaling that cultural reform was expected and would be supported. Then Natalie was announced. She emerged from the side of the stage, and the entire auditorium seemed to straighten. She was in dress blues now, the formal Navy uniform with the silver oak leaves of her rank visible on her shoulders, the command insignia pinned to her chest, her bearing reflecting decades of service and authority. The contrast with the cream-colored linen dress she had worn on Friday was absolute. She looked like a different person, not in appearance but in how she occupied space, how she commanded attention simply through her presence. She took the podium and began to speak. "Thank you, Captain Hargrove, Admiral Foster, and Admiral Moorhead," she said. "And thank you to the personnel of Westfield Naval Station for being here today. I am honored to assume command of this installation. I want to be direct about what that means." The auditorium was completely silent now. Even Garrett had stopped shifting in his seat. "This base has tremendous potential," Natalie continued. "It has dedicated personnel, critical mission responsibilities, and significant operational capabilities. But potential is only valuable if it's matched by integrity. And integrity requires that we examine ourselves honestly and commit to doing better when we fall short." She paused, her eyes scanning the auditorium, making contact with various sections of personnel. "On Friday, when I arrived at the main gate, I was treated with disrespect and discrimination," she said. The words hung in the air like a physical force. "I was denied access based on assumptions about my appearance. I was mocked. I was threatened. And I want to be very clear about something. That is not acceptable. That will not happen at Westfield again." She allowed that statement to settle before continuing. "Some of you may be aware that formal action has been taken against the personnel involved in that incident. Reassignments have been made. Retraining has been mandated. And there will be a direct conversation between myself and the individuals involved. But I'm not speaking about just that incident. I'm speaking about the culture that allowed that incident to happen." Natalie's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "I have reviewed incident reports, personnel files, and documentation of complaints that were filed but never adequately addressed. I have identified a pattern of behavior in this command that prioritizes protecting the status quo over protecting the people who serve here. That pattern ends today." In the third row, Garrett's jaw clenched noticeably. "Some of you will resist what I'm about to implement," Natalie continued. "Some of you will view cultural reform as political correctness or unnecessary change. Some of you will argue that standards are being weakened or that accountability is being used as a weapon. I want to address that directly." She gripped both sides of the podium. "Standards are not weakened by applying them fairly and consistently to everyone. Standards are strengthened by it. Authority is not undermined by accountability. It is legitimized by it. And leadership is not compromised by insisting on respectful treatment of everyone under your command. It is defined by it." Her eyes found Garrett's section again, and for just a moment, her gaze seemed to lock directly on him. "I am committed to building a command climate where people are judged by their competence, their character, and their commitment to the mission. Not by their appearance. Not by their gender. Not by how well they conform to someone's arbitrary expectations of what a leader should look like or how a professional should present themselves." Natalie stepped back from the podium slightly. "I want to thank Admiral Foster for his confidence in my leadership. I want to thank Captain Hargrove for his partnership in identifying these issues and supporting reform. And I want to thank the personnel at this base who have had the moral courage to document problems and advocate for change, even when doing so was unpopular." She returned to the center of the podium. "Effective immediately, I am establishing a command climate task force dedicated to reviewing current policies, identifying cultural problems, and implementing systemic changes. Participation in this task force will be voluntary, but participation will be considered a significant factor in performance evaluations. I am also implementing mandatory training for all personnel on respect, inclusion, and professional standards. And I am establishing a direct reporting mechanism for personnel who experience or witness misconduct. A mechanism that will bypass traditional chain of command to ensure that complaints are handled fairly and thoroughly. The auditorium seemed to hold its collective breath. "We have 1,200 personnel at this installation," Natalie said. "Each one of them represents an investment of time, resources, and trust by the Navy. My job is to create an environment where every single one of those personnel can do their best work, contribute their skills and talents, and be treated with the respect and dignity that every human being deserves. That is not negotiable. That is not subject to debate. That is the standard I am establishing for Westfield Naval Station." She paused, and in that pause the power shift was complete. Everyone in the auditorium understood that a new era had begun. The old guard, represented by people like Garrett, understood that they would either adapt or face consequences. Personnel who had been mistreated understood that they now had a leader who would take their concerns seriously. And everyone understood that the culture of Westfield Naval Station had just fundamentally changed. Natalie stepped back from the podium, and Captain Hargrove moved forward to administer the formal oath of command. As Natalie took the oath, her hand raised in a gesture of commitment, the auditorium erupted in applause. It started from the front rows, where Admiral Foster and Rear Admiral Moorhead led the way. It spread through the auditorium like a wave, personnel standing as the applause continued. Not everyone stood. Garrett remained seated. His expression hardened into something between resignation and resentment. A few personnel near him also remained seated, forming a silent pocket of resistance in an otherwise unified moment. But they were outnumbered. They were outmaneuvered. And most importantly, they were now operating under new rules, rules that had been established with the full backing of flag-level authority. The cavalry had arrived. The power shift was complete. And everyone at Westfield Naval Station now understood what change actually looked like. The formal change of command ceremony concluded at 1,515 hours. As personnel filed out of the auditorium, returning to their duty stations or heading to their vehicles, two individuals remained seated in the back rows: Petty Officer First Class Derek Thornton and Chief Petty Officer Blake Wilson. They sat in a state of anxious limbo, waiting for the summons that they knew was coming. At 1,530 hours, a junior enlisted aide approached them with a message. Commander Ashford was ready for them in her office. They were to report immediately. The walk to the commander's office felt longer than it actually was. They moved through the corridors of the headquarters building with the gait of people walking toward an execution. Other personnel they passed seemed to sense something was happening. There was a formality, an awareness, a weight to their movements that didn't go unnoticed. Commander Natalie Ashford's office was in the corner of the third floor, with windows overlooking both the flight line and the harbor beyond. The space was still mostly bare. She had only arrived Friday after all, but there was an inherent authority to the room. The nameplate on the desk read Commander N. Ashford. The chair behind the desk was positioned to look out at those windows, giving her a commanding view of her domain. She stood when they entered, but she didn't come around the desk to greet them. She remained behind it, her posture perfect, her uniform crisp, her expression grave but not unkind. "Petty Officer Thornton, Chief Wilson," she said. "Thank you for waiting. Please have a seat." They sat in the two chairs facing her desk. Thornton's hands were gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. Wilson had his hands folded in his lap, but his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. Natalie sat back down, her eyes moving from one man to the other. "I want to talk about what happened on Friday," she began, her voice quiet and measured. "Not as your new commander speaking to subordinates, but as a leader speaking to people who made a serious error in judgment. I want to understand your thinking, so I'm going to ask questions, and I expect honest answers. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," both men said in unison. "Chief Wilson," Natalie said, addressing him first, "walk me through Friday morning. From the moment you received the call from Petty Officer Thornton until the moment Captain Hargrove arrived at the gate." Wilson took a breath. "Ma'am, I was in the guard shack when Petty Officer Thornton called. He reported that there was a woman at the checkpoint claiming to be the incoming commander. He stated that she was dressed in civilian attire, had a vehicle packed with personal items, and was being uncooperative about following security procedures. I came out to assess the situation. And when you assessed the situation, what did you see? Natalie asked. I saw a woman in a light-colored dress, Wilson said. She appeared to be, well, she didn't appear to match the profile of a base commander. What does a base commander appear to look like? Natalie asked, her voice taking on a subtle edge. Wilson hesitated. I don't know exactly how to answer that, ma'am. Then let me answer it for you, Natalie said. A base commander looks like whatever a base commander looks like. Because a base commander is not defined by appearance. A base commander is defined by rank, by assignment, and by credentials, all of which were presented to you in the form of a valid common access card. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Wilson said quietly. So when you made your assessment based on how I was dressed, you were not making a security assessment. You were making a judgment based on bias. You were allowing your personal assumptions about how women should present themselves to override the official documentation of my rank and clearance. Do you understand the significance of that? Yes, ma'am. I understand now, Wilson said. Natalie turned her attention to Thornton. Petty Officer Thornton, you initiated this entire situation. You refused to scan her identification card. You made mocking comments about her appearance. You escalated the situation rather than performing your basic duty. Why? Thornton's voice was barely audible. I thought she was lying, ma'am. I thought she was testing our security. Based on what? Natalie asked. Based on how she looked, Thornton admitted. She didn't look like, she looked like she looked like a woman in civilian clothes, Natalie finished for him. And in your mind, that was incompatible with being a military commander. That's the assumption you made. And instead of simply scanning her card, which would have immediately verified her identity, you challenged her, mocked her, and attempted to intimidate her into leaving. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am, Thornton said, his voice cracking slightly. Natalie leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a long moment, simply looking at both men with an expression that was difficult to read. I'm going to tell you something, she said finally. When I was a junior officer, I served under a male commanding officer who made it very clear that he thought women didn't belong in leadership positions in the military. He was skilled at his job, knowledgeable about his field, and well respected by many people. But he had a blind spot. He couldn't see women as capable leaders because he had decided, long before he ever met most of them, that women weren't supposed to be leaders. She paused, making sure they were listening. That officer is no longer in the Navy, not because he was incompetent at his job, but because his bias undermined his ability to lead effectively. It affected the entire command climate under his supervision. People who worked for him started to internalize his biases. The culture became corrupted by his assumptions. And eventually, his assumptions became his downfall. Natalie stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the flight line, at the aircraft lined up in neat rows, at the harbor in the distance. What you did on Friday was small, she continued without turning around. It was one incident at one gate, but it reflects a larger problem. It reflects an institution that allows people like you to operate with the assumption that your personal preferences about how people should look or behave somehow supersede official regulations and personnel credentials. She turned back to face them. I want to be clear about something, she said, her voice harder now. You both have been reassigned. You will both complete mandatory retraining. But more importantly, you have both been put on notice. If I receive even one more report of similar behavior from either of you, you will face formal disciplinary action that could end your careers. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, they said together. Chief Wilson, Natalie said, you have 20 years of service. You're close to retirement. You have the opportunity to finish your career with dignity and honor. That requires you to examine the assumptions you've been making and commit to changing how you interact with personnel. That's not political correctness. That's professionalism. That's what military leadership demands. Wilson nodded, his throat tight. Petty Officer Thornton, Natalie continued, you're early in your career. You have many years ahead of you depending on the choices you make. You can continue down the path you were on, a path where bias and assumption guide your decision-making, or you can learn from this moment and become a better officer. I would recommend the latter. She returned to her desk and looked at both men directly. I'm going to tell you what I tell every person I work with, she said. I don't care about your personal beliefs or your personal preferences about how people should look or act. I care about whether you can do your job professionally. I care about whether you can treat people with respect. I care about whether you can follow regulations and apply standards consistently. Those are the only things that matter to me. She opened a drawer in her desk and withdrew 2 coins, command coins, heavy and impressive, with the emblem of Westfield Naval Station on them. These are your coins, she said. They represent the fact that you are members of this command. These coins are yours to keep. But whether you keep your place in this command depends entirely on whether you can meet the standards I'm establishing. Are we clear? Crystal clear, ma'am, both men said. Then you are dismissed, Natalie said. Go back to your new assignments. Work hard. Prove to me that you can change. Because the Navy is better when everyone is committed to the mission, and no one has to worry about being judged by someone's biased assumptions about who they are. They stood and saluted. She returned the salute. And as they turned to leave, both men understood something fundamental. They had just experienced leadership. Not punishment, though that would come if they didn't change. Not condemnation, though she had made it clear what the consequences would be. But a clear articulation of standards, a challenging of their assumptions, and a path forward that required genuine transformation. As they walked out of her office and back through the corridors, Thornton whispered to Wilson, "She's right. We were wrong." Wilson nodded. "Yeah, we were." For the first time since Friday morning, the weight on both men's shoulders felt slightly lighter. Not because the consequences had been avoided, but because the path to redemption had been clearly outlined. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after storms pass. The change of command ceremony had concluded. Personnel reassignments had been announced. The private meetings with Thornton and Wilson had taken place. Now, 48 hours after taking official command, Natalie Ashford called for an all-hands assembly in the base theater. Not a formal ceremony this time, just a gathering of the operational personnel, approximately 800 people in one space. The theater filled slowly, personnel filing in with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. There was an undercurrent of anticipation running through the crowd. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. They could feel it in the air, see it in the postures of the senior leadership who lined the sides of the stage. At 1,000 hours exactly, Natalie took the stage alone. No podium, no formal military protocol. She simply stood there in her flight suit, the working uniform of her trade, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying through the theater without amplification. "I know many of you are wondering why I called this assembly, why, just 48 hours into my command, I'm asking all of you to take time away from your duties to gather here. I want to explain why." She walked slowly across the stage, her hands clasped in front of her. "The military is built on standards," she began. "Standards for how we conduct ourselves. Standards for how we treat equipment. Standards for how we approach our mission. Those standards exist because they work. They create predictability. They create reliability. They create trust. Without standards, military organizations become chaotic. They become ineffective. They fail their mission." She paused, letting those words settle. But standards only work if they're applied consistently and fairly. The moment you start applying standards selectively, the moment you enforce them differently based on who you're dealing with or what they look like or what you assume about them, standards stop being standards. They become tools of oppression. They become mechanisms for maintaining power over people instead of mechanisms for creating effectiveness. Natalie stopped walking and faced the audience directly. 2 days ago, when I arrived at this installation, I was subjected to a situation where standards were not applied fairly. I was judged not by my credentials, not by my qualifications, but by assumptions about my appearance. And that happened because the people involved were operating under an invisible standard, one that said, "This is what a leader looks like and you don't match that description." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. "Those individuals have been reassigned," she continued. "They will receive retraining, and there are consequences for their actions. But I'm not here today to talk about them. I'm here to talk about all of us. I'm here to talk about the culture that allows those kinds of moments to happen." Natalie began walking again, moving to the other side of the stage. "I've been in the Navy for 22 years, she said. "I've served as an engineer, as a project manager, as a commanding officer of installations. I've seen some incredible examples of leadership, and I've seen some terrible examples. One thing I've learned is that the best performing commands, the ones that accomplish their missions most effectively, are the ones where people don't have to worry about being judged by someone's biases. They can focus on their work. They can contribute their skills. They can be fully present." She stopped and looked directly out at the audience. "Conversely, the worst performing commands are the ones where people are constantly managing other people's assumptions and biases, where they have to present themselves in a certain way to gain acceptance, where they have to modify their behavior to avoid triggering someone's prejudices. That kind of environment doesn't produce excellence. Produces stress. Produces resentment. It produces people who are operating at a fraction of their full capacity." Natalie's voice grew stronger. "I have reviewed the cultural issues at this installation," she said. "I have read incident reports. I have looked at complaint files. I have examined personnel records. And I want to be very clear about what I found. There is a pattern of behavior in this command that prioritizes some people's comfort over other people's inclusion. There is a pattern of enforcement that is selective. There is a pattern of protection, where senior personnel protect junior personnel who share their assumptions, and junior personnel who challenge those assumptions face retaliation or dismissal." She paused, her gaze scanning the audience. "That pattern ends today," she said quietly. "And I want to explain why." She moved to the center of the stage. "Military leadership is about one thing: accomplishing the mission while taking care of the people under your command. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is noise. And you cannot take care of people while simultaneously judging them based on bias and assumption. It's impossible. It's a contradiction." Natalie's voice took on an edge. "Taking care of people means treating them fairly. It means applying standards consistently. It means evaluating them based on their competence, their character, and their commitment, not based on whether they fit your personal preferences about how they should look or act. When you do that, when you truly treat people fairly, something remarkable happens. They perform better. They contribute more. They bring their full selves to the mission instead of spending energy managing other people's biases." She walked to the edge of the stage. "I've also reviewed the operational metrics for this installation," she continued. "And what I found is interesting. The departments that have the most diverse leadership, the departments that actively recruit and promote people from different backgrounds, those departments have the highest mission completion rates. The departments that are more homogeneous, the departments where people tend to look and think like each other, those departments have lower rates of innovation and higher rates of personnel turnover." She let that data point land. "What that tells me is that bias isn't just morally wrong. It's operationally ineffective. When you exclude people based on bias, you lose the benefit of their skills, their perspectives, their contributions. That's not just an equity issue. That's a mission effectiveness issue." Natalie climbed back onto the stage and stood in the center. "So here's what I'm committing to," she said. "I am committing to building a command climate where every single person, regardless of their gender, their race, their background, their appearance, their religion, or any other characteristic, is treated with respect and evaluated based on their performance. I am committing to applying standards fairly and consistently. I am committing to holding leadership accountable when they fail to do the same." Her voice was steady, powerful, and absolute. "And I am asking all of you to commit to the same thing. Not because it's politically correct. Not because it makes you feel good. But because it makes us more effective. Because it makes us stronger. Because it allows us to accomplish our mission at the highest level." Natalie looked directly at the audience one more time. Some of you will resist this, she said. Some of you will think that I'm being too aggressive about this. Some of you will argue that military standards are being weakened or that political correctness is destroying the military. I want to address that directly. She paused. If you believe that treating people fairly weakens military standards, you are wrong. If you believe that inclusion destroys effectiveness, you are wrong. And if you are unwilling to change your mindset about this, then you need to understand that you will not thrive in my command. You will not advance. And you will be in constant friction with the culture I'm building here. The statement was delivered without anger, but with absolute clarity. However, she continued, if you are willing to examine your assumptions, if you are willing to challenge yourself, if you are willing to commit to fairness and respect, then you will find that this command becomes a place where you can do your best work. You will find that your career flourishes. You will find that you are part of something truly excellent. Natalie stepped back slightly. The military has a saying, she said. Embrace the suck. It means accept the difficult parts of military service and move forward. Well, I'm asking you to embrace something else. Embrace the growth. Embrace the challenge of examining your biases. Embrace the opportunity to become a better leader. Embrace the chance to be part of a command that operates with integrity and excellence. She looked out at the sea of faces before her. We are going to do remarkable things at Westfield Naval Station, she said. We are going to accomplish our mission with excellence. We are going to build a culture where people can bring their full selves to work. And we are going to prove that fairness and excellence are not opposites. They are partners. She raised her hand in a gesture that encompassed the entire audience. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your dedication. And I look forward to leading this command forward. Dismissed. As personnel filed out of the theater, there was a different quality to the silence than there had been before. Some people looked thoughtful, processing what they had heard. Some looked energized, finally feeling seen and supported. Some looked defensive, already constructing arguments in their minds about why the commander was wrong. But almost everyone understood one thing. The culture at Westfield Naval Station had fundamentally shifted. The old way of doing things was over. And whether they embraced that change or resisted it, they were now operating under a new set of rules, enforced with absolute clarity and backed by the full authority of the command. The teaching moment had been delivered. The wisdom had been shared. And now came the hard part, implementation, accountability, and the daily work of actually building that culture. The weeks following the all-hands assembly unfolded with the kind of intensity that characterized organizational transformation. The rhetoric of change had been established. Now came the difficult work of implementation, accountability, and testing whether the commitment to new standards would actually hold. Natalie created the Cultural Reform Task Force she had announced during the change of command ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun agreed to chair it, bringing with her the credibility of someone who had experienced the systemic problems firsthand. The task force met twice weekly, reviewing policies, identifying cultural barriers, and creating new protocols for reporting and addressing misconduct. The participation was voluntary, as Natalie had stated, but the response was overwhelming. 43 personnel volunteered to be part of the task force, far more than she had expected. The mandatory training on respect, inclusion, and professional standards began the following week. All 1,200 personnel were required to complete it. The training was not generic corporate diversity training. It was specifically tailored to the culture problems that existed at Westfield. It included case studies based on actual incidents that had occurred at the base, with identifying information removed, scenarios that forced personnel to examine their own biases, and clear articulation of the consequences for violations. Master Sergeant Thomas Garrett took the training on a Wednesday afternoon. He sat through the 4-hour session with his arms crossed, his expression suggesting that he was enduring something he considered nonsense. When asked to participate in small group discussions about unconscious bias, he offered minimal engagement. When asked to share personal examples of times he had challenged his own assumptions, he remained silent. By Friday of that first week, Natalie received a report from the training facilitator noting Garrett's lack of engagement. More significantly, She received a report that Garrett had made comments to junior enlisted personnel suggesting that the commander's training initiative was political correctness garbage, and that real military standards were being undermined. She called Garrett to her office immediately. He entered with the bearing of someone who had no intention of backing down. He stood at attention, his uniform perfect, his posture rigid. But there was an undercurrent of defiance in his expression. "Master Sergeant Garrett," Natalie said, not bothering with preamble. "I received a report that during the mandatory training, you were minimally engaged. That's concerning, but not necessarily a violation. However, I also received a report that you have been discouraging junior enlisted personnel from taking the training seriously and suggesting that my cultural reform initiative is, and I'm quoting, political correctness garbage." Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. "Is that accurate?" Natalie asked. "I may have expressed my opinions to my peers, ma'am," Garrett said carefully. "Your peers?" Natalie asked. "The junior enlisted personnel you were speaking to are not your peers. They are your subordinates. And you were using your position of authority to discourage them from engaging with a command-directed initiative. That's not expressing an opinion. That's insubordination. Do you understand?" "With respect, ma'am, I was having a conversation," Garrett said. "With respect, Master Sergeant, you were undermining your commanding officer's authority," Natalie replied coldly. "And you're going to stop. Effective immediately, you will attend supplemental training on leadership accountability. You will model full engagement with the Cultural Reform Initiative. And you will cease all negative commentary about this command's priorities. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Garrett said, but his tone suggested he understood only in the literal sense, not the deeper meaning. "Master Sergeant," Natalie continued, "you have a choice to make. You can choose to embrace the changes I'm implementing here. You can choose to examine your assumptions and grow as a leader. You can choose to be part of building something excellent. Or you can choose to resist. But I want to be very clear about the consequences of that choice." She stood and walked around her desk, positioning herself closer to Garrett. "You have 23 years of service," she said. "In 2 years, you'll be eligible for full retirement. That's close enough that every decision you make now will affect whether you reach that retirement as a respected member of this command or whether you spend the next 2 years in a constant state of friction with your commanding officer." She paused to let that sink in. "The Command Climate Task Force is documenting all personnel who actively resist cultural reform," she continued. "If you continue down this path, those documented instances will become part of your official record. They will be included in your performance evaluation. And that evaluation will directly impact your ability to retire with the honors and respect that you may be counting on." Garrett's expression shifted slightly. A flash of something that might have been concern crossed his face. "However," Natalie continued, "if you choose to engage with this process authentically, if you choose to challenge yourself, if you choose to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem, then I will support your final 2 years and ensure that you leave this command with the respect and recognition you deserve." She returned to her desk and sat down. "The choice is yours, Master Sergeant. But I want you to understand that it is a choice. And there are consequences either way." Garrett left the office without responding beyond a, "Yes, ma'am, understood." But something had shifted. The threat of having his retirement compromised, of having his official record tainted by documented resistance, was a more concrete consequence than anything else Natalie had said. Over the next few weeks, Garrett's behavior changed. It wasn't enthusiastic. He didn't suddenly become a champion of cultural reform. But he stopped actively undermining the initiative. He attended the supplemental training. He ceased making negative comments to junior personnel. He modeled, if not genuine engagement, at least compliance. 3 weeks into Natalie's command, the formal disciplinary proceedings against Petty Officer Thornton were finalized. He had been transferred to the Civil Engineer Squadron as Major Sterling had directed. He was completing his retraining. And most importantly, he was working. Really working. His new squadron commander reported that Thornton was first in, last out, was eager to learn, and was demonstrating significant behavioral change. Natalie arranged to observe Thornton during one of his training sessions. She watched from the back of the classroom as he participated in a scenario-based exercise. When asked about how to handle a situation involving a civilian employee who was presenting proper credentials but didn't match his expectations, Thornton responded with exactly the right answer. Scan the credentials, verify the information, process the request according to regulations. No assumptions, no bias, just procedure. After the session, she spoke to him briefly. "Petty Officer Thornton, how is the retraining going?" she asked. He snapped to attention. "Very well, ma'am. I'm learning a lot about professional standards and how to apply them fairly." "Your commander tells me you're doing good work," Natalie said. "I want you to know that I see it. I see personnel who are willing to learn from their mistakes. That means something to me." Relief flooded Thornton's face. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." "Don't thank me yet," Natalie said. "You still have work to do, but you're heading in the right direction. Keep it up." Chief Wilson's situation was different. His reassignment to logistics had gone smoothly, but his engagement with the cultural reform process was hesitant. He attended the training, but he seemed more interested in compliance than in genuine transformation. 3 weeks in, Natalie didn't see the kind of deep reflection that would suggest real change. She called him to her office. "Chief Wilson, I want to talk about your transition to logistics," she began. "How are you settling in?" "Well, ma'am," Wilson said carefully, "the work is different, but I'm adjusting." "And how is your engagement with the Cultural Reform Initiative?" Natalie asked. Wilson hesitated. "I'm completing the training, ma'am. I'm meeting the requirements." "Meeting the requirements is the minimum," Natalie said. "I'm asking whether you're actually engaging with the content. Are you examining your own biases? Are you thinking about how your decisions affect people?" "Yes, ma'am," Wilson said, but the answer felt hollow. Natalie sighed. "Chief, you have 90 days of probationary reassignment. After those 90 days, we'll reassess. If you're just going through the motions, if you're just trying to make this blow over so you can return to business as usual, then we won't have the outcome we need. But if you're genuinely willing to examine yourself and change, then you have an opportunity to become a better leader." She leaned forward. 20 years of service is significant. You've built a career here, but what matters now is what you do in these next 90 days. That will determine whether you spend your final years in the Navy as someone who represents excellence and integrity, or as someone who was resistant to necessary change. Wilson left that meeting with more clarity about what was expected. Over the following weeks, he began to engage more authentically with the process. He didn't suddenly become a crusader for cultural reform, but he started asking genuine questions during training. He started reflecting on his own biases. He started behaving like someone who understood that his career legacy would be determined by his willingness to change. By the 6-week mark of Natalie's command, a pattern had become clear. Personnel who engaged authentically with the cultural reform process were being supported and recognized. Personnel who were passively compliant were being monitored. And personnel who actively resisted were facing documented consequences. It was a framework that offered redemption, but required genuine commitment. The consequence and redemption equation was in place. The question now was whether it would actually transform the culture at Westfield Naval Station. 3 months had passed since Natalie Ashford took command of Westfield Naval Station. The summer heat had given way to the gentler temperatures of early autumn. The base continued its operations with the same precision and dedication as always, but there was something fundamentally different about the atmosphere now. Something that couldn't be measured in operational metrics, but was visible in the way personnel interacted with each other, in the way decisions were made, in the overall tenor of the command. It was a Friday afternoon, and Natalie found herself in the base commissary, pushing a cart through the aisles. She was in her flight suit, having just come from a meeting with her operations staff. The uniform was working attire for her now, not ceremonial. She had promised herself that she would spend time walking through the base, seeing how things actually operated, talking to personnel across all ranks. This afternoon's trip to the commissary was part of that commitment. She was turning into the cleaning supplies aisle when she saw him. Petty Officer Derek Thornton was stocking shelves in the civil engineer supply section. He wasn't wearing the security force's beret anymore. Instead, He had the uniform of his new squadron. But there was something noticeably different about him beyond the uniform. His posture was different. His movements had a purposefulness that hadn't been there before. When he looked up and saw Commander Ashford, he immediately set down the box he was holding and snapped to attention. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and respectful. "At ease, petty officer," Natalie said, approaching him. "How are you settling in with your new squadron?" "Very well, ma'am," Thornton replied, relaxing slightly. "The work is different from security forces, but I found it rewarding. My commander says I'm doing well." Natalie studied him for a moment. The defensive posture from their earlier confrontation was gone. In its place was something more genuine, a person who had been humbled by his mistakes and was genuinely trying to do better. "I was in your training session last month," Natalie said. "I observed you during the scenario exercise. You handled that situation perfectly. You applied the regulations without letting bias influence your decision-making." "Thank you, ma'am," Thornton said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. "That means a lot coming from you, especially after what happened at the gate." "That was 3 months ago," Natalie said. "What matters is what you've done since then. You made a choice to change and you followed through on that choice. That takes integrity." She picked up a bottle of detergent from the shelf. "Don't let me down, Petty Officer Thornton. I need people in this command who understand the difference between authority and respect. You're becoming one of them." "I won't let you down, ma'am," Thornton said with conviction. Natalie continued through the commissary, and as she turned the corner, she saw Chief Petty Officer Blake Wilson entering from the opposite direction. He was in his logistics squadron uniform now, and he was carrying a clipboard. Clearly he was on official business. Their eyes met, and Wilson immediately approached. "Commander Ashford, ma'am," he said, saluting. She returned the salute. "Chief Wilson, how is the probationary reassignment going?" "Very well, ma'am," Wilson said. "We're about 2 weeks away from the end of the probationary period. My new commander has been supportive, and I've been working through the cultural reform training material." "Have you been working through it? Or have you been genuinely engaging with it?" Natalie asked. Wilson hesitated, then said, "Genuinely engaging with it, ma'am. I've come to understand that my decision-making on Friday wasn't just about making a mistake. It was about operating with biases that I hadn't examined. I've been trying to understand where those biases come from and how to make sure they don't affect my leadership in the future." Natalie nodded. This was different from the hollow compliance she had seen in the early weeks. "I'm pleased to hear that," she said. "When your probationary period concludes, I'll want you to brief the Cultural Reform Task Force about your experience. I think your perspective, someone who made a significant mistake and is actively working to change, could be valuable for other personnel who are still in the early stages of reflection." Wilson's eyes widened slightly. "You want me to brief the task force, ma'am?" "Yes," Natalie confirmed. "Not as punishment or as a way of publicly acknowledging your mistake, but as a way of demonstrating that change is possible, that people can examine their biases and become better leaders. That's an important message for this command to hear." Wilson saluted again. "I appreciate that opportunity, ma'am. I'll do my best." As Natalie continued through the commissary, she reflected on how far the command had come in 3 months. The official metrics were beginning to show improvement as well. The command climate survey that had been conducted at her arrival showed areas of significant concern. Personnel satisfaction was low, trust in leadership was fragmented, and diversity and inclusion scores were well below naval standards. But the survey conducted just weeks ago showed measurable improvement across nearly every category. Personnel felt more respected. They had greater trust in leadership. And most significantly, personnel from minority backgrounds reported feeling more valued and included. More personnel had volunteered for the Cultural Reform Task Force. The mandatory training had been completed by over 95% of personnel. And perhaps most importantly, the number of personnel reporting incidents of bias or misconduct had actually increased, which Natalie knew was a positive sign. It meant people felt safe enough to report problems, which was the foundation of any real cultural change. But there had been resistance too. Master Sergeant Garrett had eventually chose to take early retirement rather than continue in the new command climate. Several other senior personnel had also left or requested transfers. Natalie didn't celebrate their departures, but she acknowledged them as a natural consequence of transformation. Some people couldn't adapt. Some people were too invested in the old system to embrace a new one. And that was okay. It was realistic. That evening, Natalie attended a recognition ceremony for the personnel who had contributed most significantly to the Cultural Reform Initiative. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun was honored for her leadership of the task force. Several junior enlisted personnel were recognized for having the courage to report misconduct despite the institutional resistance. And several senior leaders, including Commander James Whitmore and Master Chief Petty Officer David Foster, were acknowledged for supporting change even when it was unpopular. As she watched the ceremony, Natalie thought about the broader significance of what had happened at Westfield. The incident at the gate on her first day had been small, just 2 security personnel making biased decisions. But that small incident had become the catalyst for systematic transformation. And the transformation had rippled through the entire command, affecting how 1,200 people approached their work, their leadership, and their treatment of each other. 3 months wasn't a long time. True cultural change took years. But in 3 months, Natalie had established a foundation. She had made it clear that bias would not be tolerated. She had offered pathways to redemption for people willing to change. She had recognized and supported those who embraced the new culture. And she had allowed those who couldn't adapt to leave. The real test would come in the months and years ahead. Would personnel maintain the commitment to fairness and respect? Would new incidents be handled with the same zero-tolerance approach? Would the command climate continue to improve, or would it slowly drift back to the old patterns? Those were questions that couldn't be answered in 3 months. But as Natalie looked around the recognition ceremony, at the faces of personnel who had chosen to engage with the process of change, she felt hopeful. Later that night, back in her office, Natalie reviewed the latest operational metrics. Mission completion rates were up. Personnel retention rates had improved. Sick leave and mental health visits had decreased, suggesting that personnel were experiencing less stress. And perhaps most tellingly, the number of personnel requesting transfers to other bases had dropped significantly. People wanted to stay. They felt valued. They felt like they were part of something meaningful. She pulled out her personal journal and made a note. 3 months in, the foundation is solid. The direction is clear. Now comes the sustained work of actually living it every day. This is the hard part. This is where most institutional change efforts fail. Not in the dramatic beginning, but in the sustained commitment to the vision. I have to make sure that doesn't happen here. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the base below. The lights of Westfield Naval Station twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Petty Officer Thornton was settling into his new role. Somewhere, Chief Wilson was reflecting on his journey from bias to understanding. And somewhere, personnel who had been marginalized or dismissed were feeling, for the first time in a long time, that they truly belonged. That was the proof of change. Not perfect systems or flawless implementation, but the simple fact that people felt seen, valued, and respected. And from that foundation, anything was possible. The work continued. The journey was far from over, but the direction was set. And at Westfield Naval Station, culture was being transformed, one decision, one interaction, one moment of choosing fairness over bias at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.